acids and bases. Okay, pH, all that good stuff. That's all happening here. We'll talk more about the biological implications of acids and bases later, but keep in mind homeostasis here, right? We all need to keep all these different components in a very strict range. pH, which is a measure of how acidic or basic something is, also is kept within a homeostasis range for organisms, right? Like our blood is usually kept at a pH of 7.4, okay? Too high, too low, out of homeostasis, no homeostasis, dead, right? But really, the key, what I want you to remember here about acids and bases, we're just moving protons. H plus is going to move around from one molecule to another, and that results in a change in pH. That's all. All right, so water, our friend water. Talking about how awesome water is, all of its unique properties, it's some real cool stuff, yeah? But when we talk about pH and acids and bases, one of the really important properties of water is this fact that it can act as both an acid and a base. What I mean by that is water can both accept a proton, accept a hydrogen atom, and donate a hydrogen ion to solution. So when water is in the presence of an acid, it can accept an extra proton, become H3O+, what we call a hydronium ion. Or sometimes water can get rid of one of these hydrogens, become what we call hydroxide ion, okay, or OH-. So water has this cool ability to either accept or donate a hydrogen ion depending on the environment in which it is in. We call this process of moving back and forth, water will move in one direction or the other based on the pH of the solution that water's in. Okay? We call this equilibrium constant of water. Water is constantly moving back and forth, and when it's at pH of 7, concentration of hydronium will equal the concentration of hydroxide. At pH of 7, these two concentrations are equal. Okay, so water's cool. It can pick up or it can donate an extra hydrogen ion. So, okay, but what's an acid? You're like, water can be both an acid and base. Well, what does that really mean chemically? An acid is any substance which donates a proton, H+, when it's dissolved in water. Okay, this H+ that it donates is usually picked up by water to form hydronium. Okay, so typically there aren't going to be many H+ just floating around in solution. They'll be picked up by water to form hydronium. Okay. As we increase the concentration of H3O+, of hydronium, in a solution, the pH is lower. Okay, so our pH scale runs from 0 to 14. A pH below 7 is acidic. And the more acidic something is, the closer to 0 it will be. So here we have hydrochloric acid. We're going to dissolve it in water. What happens when we dissolve hydrochloric acid in water is that HCl, that hydrogen and that chlorine atom, they break apart. It's an ionic bond that's holding those together. So that ionic bond breaks apart when it's dissolved in water, which results in a chlorine ion floating around. And this hydrogen ion is picked up by water to form hydronium. Okay, so H and Cl separate when they're dissolved in water. Cl- just floats around as an ion. This H+ ends up here with water to make hydronium, H3O+. Okay, so really, really high concentration of H3O+, really, really low pH. The higher the concentration of hydronium, the lower the pH. Okay, what's a base? So bases are any substances which can accept a proton. Okay, so if we were to put in some extra hydrogen ions into a solution, bases would pick up those extra hydrogen ions. Okay, so they accept the proton. Acids donate, bases accept. Bases usually result in an increase of the concentration of OH minus hydroxide ions. Okay, so if something is basic, you could also sometimes call it alkaline. It's going to have a pH of above 7. 7 to 14 is a basic solution. So for example, if we take sodium hydroxide, so here's a sodium ion, here's hydroxide, OH, okay, sodium hydroxide. When it's dissolved in water, it breaks apart into Na plus and OH minus. You're like, wait, nothing here is accepting a proton. This OH minus very well could accept a proton. Could very easily grab onto an H plus to form water. Okay. So bases usually have a high concentration of OH minus, but not all of them do. We're going to see some bases that do not have a concentration of OH minus, but they can still accept extra protons. Bases, usually OH minus, accept protons and result in a higher pH, above 7. Okay, so acid-base neutralization, what's going on here? We mix an acid and base, they will neutralize each other. Okay, so what does that mean? So remember, we'll take out the hydronium and we'll just talk about hydrochloric acid, dissolved in water, results in H plus Cl minus floating around in an aqueous solution. Okay, so hydrochloric acid, when it's dissolved in water, dissociates in the H plus Cl minus. This H plus is typically picked up by water to make hydronium. But what if we add in a base, sodium hydroxide that we just talked about? What if we combine these two? Which molecule is probably more likely to pick up this extra hydrogen? Water or this hydroxide? It's hydroxide, because OH minus, looking for something positive right here, right? So when we add acids and bases, they will neutralize each other, meaning there's very little change in pH if they're at the same concentrations. So let's say we combine hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide together in water. What would happen? We get salt, sodium chloride, and water, right? Na plus, Cl minus, OH minus, H plus. Combine acid and base and water, they neutralize to form salt and water. Okay. As long as they're at the same concentrations, we'll basically get to a pH of neutral, 0. pH of 7. 0 is very acidic. I don't know why I said that. Equal concentration of hydronium and hydroxide, pH of 7, which is neutral, when we combine equal concentrations of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. Probably heard the term, it's a really, really strong acid, or that base is very, very, very strong. Not talking about being at a concert, but what makes an acid or base strong or weak, right? So like hydrochloric acid versus something like lemon juice or soda, right? Those are all acidic, but hydrochloric acid is way stronger than lemon juice or soda, right? So what makes something strong or weak in terms of its acidity or if it's basic is how easily it dissociates when we dissolve it in water. So we consider it a strong acid or strong base if 100% of those molecules dissociate when we dissolve them in water. So these are usually ionic compounds. It's like hydrochloric acid, that's an ionic compound. 100% of it dissolves in water to form hydronium and chlorine ions. Okay. Same thing with sodium hydroxide. It's a really, really strong base, basically pH of 14. This, again, is an ionic compound because sodium makes an ion. 100% of it dissociates when we dissolve it in water, so it's a very strong base. Okay, so that's not true of all acids or bases. Okay, not all of them will easily dissociate in water. So if only like maybe 50% of them dissociate, it'd be a pretty relatively weak acid or base. Okay, so that's the percentage of the molecules that dissociate, which makes an acid strong or weak, or a base strong or weak. Okay, so we've talked about pH. You probably have a basic sense of what pH is. It's a way to measure acidity or something is basic, right? But what is it in a chemical sense? What is pH? So pH is a measure of concentration of H plus or hydronium in a solution. Okay, so we'll use H plus and hydronium kind of interchangeably here. Usually when an acid dissociates, it will typically grab grab onto water and form hydronium. But we can, just for purposes of making life easier, we'll just shorten H plus here, okay? So it's a measure of the concentration of H plus or hydronium in a solution, okay? If you watched the molar video or the video about moles, concentration, the unit for concentration is usually molar, moles per liter, okay? So if you haven't watched that video yet, stop watching this one and go back and watch that video about moles first, because this will make a whole lot more sense. So these brackets, whenever you see these brackets like this, that's a concentration. That's a clue that's our signal basically to say it's a concentration measurement here that's going here. So this value right here would mean moles per liter of hydrogen ions in a solution. So again, 0 from 14 is our typical pH range. Anything below 7 we consider acidic. Anything above 7 is basic or alkaline. Right at 7, it's neutral. Okay, so pH of 7 is neutral, meaning that there's an equal concentration of H plus and OH minus in the solution. Okay, so these brackets, remember, molar, big M, concentration. So let's practice a calculation. So pH equals the negative log of the concentration of hydrogen ions. Or another way to think about it is the concentration of hydrogen ions equals 10 to the negative pH. Okay, these are equal to each other basically. So log is basically the inverse of an exponent. So log is the inverse of an exponent. So if we take the log of something, that basically brings the exponent down. And this is a log base 10. So this basically cancels this 10 out in a way, and it's the inverse. So it's the negative. So we have the negative of the log of 10 to the negative fifth, pH equals 5. Okay, so if we have a solution that has a concentration of 10 to the negative 5 molar of H3O plus, what is the pH? This concentration right here goes in right here into our equation, negative log of H plus. So 10 to the negative 5 molar, remember that's moles per liter. Take the negative log of that. Those negatives cancel out. That log basically takes away that 10, so we have a pH of 5. So without getting too deep into the math, basically if you're given a concentration and it's base 10, so 10 to the negative 5, 10 to the negative 6, 10 to the negative 4.3, whatever, as long as it's base 10, you can just take that 10 away and turn this exponent positive and you get the pH. Okay, now there's another half to this equation. It's called the POH, power of hydroxide. pH means power of hydrogen, POH is power of hydroxide. Here's the key though. pH plus POH is equal to 14. So those two numbers, these two values, is equal to 14. Really if pH is measuring the concentration, in a sense, of hydronium ions, POH is measuring the concentration of hydroxide ions. And these two values added together will equal 14. Okay, but same idea here, negative log of the concentration of hydroxide. Same idea. Okay, we're typically going to work in this pH value, but it's good to know that POH also exists and that these two added together equal 14. So let's take an example. We have a we have a solution that has a POH of 10. What is its pH? So POH is 10, we can sub in 10 right here. That would give us, we subtract 10 from either side to get to pH, subtract 10 from either side to give us a pH of 4, right? 4 plus 10 is 14. So if we're given the pH or the POH, you should be able to find the other value. Solution has a POH of 10, okay? We figured out the pH was 4, but can we now use that concentration to figure out the hydronium ion concentration, right? So what is the hydronium ion concentration of this solution if it has a POH of 10? So So we know the pH is 4. We just calculated that in our last step. How then do we get to this number right here? Da-da-da! This part of our equation right here. Hydronium ion concentration equals 10 to the negative pH. Okay, so 10 to the negative 4. pH equals 4. Negative log of H0 plus is equal to 10 to the negative 4. Okay, so there's a hydronium ion concentration right here. Boop. 10 to the negative 4. Okay, and again, this is our concentration, so this would be in molar. So I didn't put it, I should put it. The units would be big and molar, but that's indicated by these brackets. Again, probably like, oh, so much chemistry, why does this matter? Well, it matters, one, because the acidity, the pH of all of our systems are kept in very, very tight control. Anything that changes the acidity of that different organ or organ system can have massive health effects, right? The other major issue is that a lot of active components of pharmaceuticals are not soluble in water, which can be a huge problem because if they're not soluble in water, it's going to be hard to get them to move around the body, right? If we add in an acid to this active compound, it can make it a little bit more soluble, right? Like the cough syrup codeine. It's produced, the active ingredient in codeine is not soluble in water. Mix it with a little hydrochloric acid, breaks it apart in such a way it forms an ion that it does become soluble in water and can now be used as a common painkiller. Okay, so acids and bases, 1, homeostasis, 2, very common in a lot of pharmaceuticals. But let's talk more about that application in homeostasis. Okay, so different parts of our body maintain very specific pHs. Okay, our stomach is usually at a pH of like 2, our blood is usually a pH of 7.4, right? Our saliva is a little bit higher than that. So each region needs to maintain its pH at that very specific level because that's the region in which the molecules that make that organ system or that region of that body function, they function best in that specific pH. Okay, so like in our blood, the enzymes and cells that are functioning and moving throughout our blood function best at a pH of 7.4. But that pH can change based on environmental factors, right? So if our pH drops and becomes very acidic or rises very quickly and becomes very alkaline, very basic, that can have major implications for how those cells and those enzymes and those proteins that are functioning in our blood work. So our body is full of what we call buffers. So buffers are molecules or solutions which resist changes in pH. They help to maintain pH at a certain level. It could be a buffer that keeps that pH at 2. It could be a buffer that keeps that pH at 8. Doesn't matter. But they resist changes and keep that pH at a very specific range. Okay? These buffers are usually due to the presence of a weak acid and its conjugate base, or vice versa, a weak base and its conjugate acid. So what I mean by that is when we have, for example, carbonic acid, H2CO3, this is an acid that's going to donate a proton. After it's donated a proton, we call this HCO3 minus its conjugate base. Because this, in theory, this molecule right here could accept a proton. Okay? So acid, conjugate base. Okay? So each base in acid dissolves into its conjugate acid and conjugate base. Okay? So this buffer right here, this is the buffer that keeps us alive. Right? So our blood needs to stay at a pH of 7.4. How this works is that when we increase our rate of respiration, so let's say we increase, how much exercise we're doing, there's going to be more carbon dioxide put into our blood. That's going to cause more carbonic acid, which could result in our pH to drop down, right? But because we also have this bicarbonate ion right here, this HCO3 minus, this usually minimizes the effect of any increase of carbon dioxide. So see these double arrows? This basically means that these equations can go either way. See, extra CO2 can cause extra carbonic acid, but that also can result in extra bicarbonate, okay? Or it can go the other way, okay? So carbonic acid or bicarbonate in our blood is a buffer that keeps our blood at pH of 7.4. We're very close to that, okay? So it maintains pH of a specific level.